Welcome to the Drew and Luke podcast. I'm Andy Luke, and I'm here with my very special guest today, Phil Boyce, to talk about Oink's 35th anniversary. Welcome, Phil.
Hi, Andy. How's it going?
All right. Good summer weather.
Finally, yeah.
35 years ago, almost we were witness to just this wonderful, anarchic kids comic that I really kind of felt pushed a lot of boundaries and sort of defined a sort of a generation of readers and cartoonists. And
Yeah.
so we'll give, there's a lot of people here listening who know what Oink was, exactly what it meant to them. But I think we'll just sort of give this sort of overview. It was a sort of anthology of short comic strips, very much like you might find in the Beano or the Dandy, but it had a very independent attitude, a real outlier streak about it. Streak being the operative word there.
Yeah, it was very different. The creators of it, it's Mark Rogers, who was maybe IPC's most prolific comic strip writer at the time, Patrick Gallagher and Tony Husband, who was and still is known for Private Eye, amongst many other things. They were tired of the formulaic 1960s, 70s humor that comics were still expected to follow. There's an awful lot of rules and censorship, and they thought, nope, this isn't serving the kids of the day. We need to do something different. And they thought if they could make themselves laugh, they can make us laugh. And that's what they did. But yes, Anarchy is, I think, the key to it all.
Yeah, I think that was really important in making that connection with the reader. Like you said, the older stuff was very much, it was tied to a very different era. And I think Oink gave the kids a different way to relate to the world around them. And so we have, like you mentioned, cartoonists from Private Eye, Punch, working on it. You had a cartoonist like Lou Stringer, got his big break there, I think, who would have...
Yes, he had done a few bits and pieces, but that was his big break. And I think an awful lot of the appeal was, as well, a lot of cartoonists who hadn't worked for children before. You mentioned Punch there, like Jeremy Banks. He brought some really surreal humor or surrealism to it, which you wouldn't expect. You wouldn't get in other kids' comics at the time. But yeah, that was a lot to do with it, bringing in artists who had never worked in this kind of format before, just to make it completely fresh.
As the name relates, it was very much a pig-themed comic. Every pig pun that you can think of had been in that comic. The face of the comic was Uncle Pig, who was the editor, who appeared throughout pages, and we talk more about him. There was Mary Lighthouse, who was modelled on the morality campaigner Mary Whitehouse, who was very big in the 1980s and decades around there. And you had poos and plops and farts and burps and all the gooey, stinky stuff that kids love to, which are swears for kids.
Yes, yeah. I mean, to quote Mark Rogers, he said it was the humor that they liked. So they didn't speak down to the audience, and they liked violent, anarchic, weird, generally lunatic, and very modern. When you hear the word violent, first of all, Mary Whitehouse and her group would probably get up in arms about that, but you're talking sort of Looney Tunes, Tom and Jerry, and yes, they were old-fashioned, but that kind of, when they really went violent, they could go really violent, and that's what kids even in the 80s really loved. But you had the Torture Twins were medieval torturers. They made a good funny joke out of them, but you also had, it wasn't something which was going to teach children to do these things. Tom Thug was a school bully, and parents complained at the time, who completely missed the point, that you had a comic strip based on a school bully being the hero. I was like, nope. Every week he failed through slapstick or whatever. It took him 10 issues. In the preview issue, his dad gave him he handed down the family bother boots. His dad was, you sort of him up in his 40s, was finally going to retire and get a job. So he's going to retire being the bully and actually get a job. And he gave Tom his boots. But it took Tom until issue 10 to actually learn to tie them and put them on. and only after Uncle Pig threatened to cut his strip down to half a page every issue, so it was, and it had a very strong anti-smoking theme throughout, which has a funny story next to it, I'm sure we'll get to later. But yes, anarchy and mayhem, which critics at the time completely went over their head, and they thought it was something else.
So I think for me, the certainly not when reading it the first time, but when rereading it, the culture of the 1980s and the temperature in the UK was very, very relational to that rebellious streak of Oink. So it was 86, we had the Falklands War in 82. We would have been well into the miners' strike, decimating Yorkshire. Thatcher just privatising everything in sight, record levels of joblessness. I think by about year 1 or 2 of Oink, it would have been like 10% joblessness in the UK. And you had punk would have been earlier, late 70s, 80s. So it was the dying embers, I think, found their way into Oink. It was Punk Junior. And that sort of, and you start to see elements of punk drifting into popular culture, or not drifting, really, sort of bashing their way in. We had Adrian on the Young Ones. I remember very clearly as a kid. And he sort of feeds into like characters like Headbanger, and there was a lot of that punk, a little bit of that punk iconography. I don't want to sort of, I don't know. I think you're probably the guy to know whether Husband Gallagher and Rogers had a punk agenda.
They very much did. Speaking to Tony, he always likens working in Oink, especially the 3 editors together, to being in a punk band. And I mean, he said that the Oink office, it was all sort of done remotely, which is something that's so common these days. But back then, the artists would be working all over the UK, including some here in Northern Ireland. But the central offices where it was put together weren't IPC's offices in London. They were in Manchester, where Patrick, Mark, and Tony were. So there's definitely that sort of north of England, that sort of mid-late 80s feel to it, very purposely. But they were in an office building where, all around them were the offices for the manager of the Happy Mondays. There was the Hacienda DJ was next door. Downstairs, Mark Riley and Chris Seavey worked. Chris Seavey's Frank Sidebottom, and obviously Mark Riley himself was part of the Fall band as well. It was very much, Tony says, was like being in a band, the 3 of them, and just Oink's punk nature. Even at the end, when Oink lasted for 2.5 years, Tony likens it again to punk, saying it's better to burn out than fade away. He says, we came out at the same time, he says, as punk, and the Manchester scene at the time, he says Oink was part of that. I mean, and when you read through the series, when I did, about 7 years ago now, last time I read through it all, which I'm starting to do again, but the amount of musical celebrities who are pictured with copies of the comic who read it, and IPC loved this. So they did. It might not have sold the 250,000 that Bolster and Wizard and Chips did, but at its height, it was selling about 100,000 every issue, which is every fortnight. The good press that came with it, I mean, all press is good press, and I'm sure the controversy, IPC loved that because they were seen as very safe and serene normally, but the celebrity promotion of a comic, and IPC loved that at the time. So it was all very much part of it. So the fact you picked up on that shows it did its job, So
I'm interested in what you can tell us about how Tony, Patrick, and Mark came together. You mentioned chance meetings in pubs.
Well, the pub meetings came a bit later. It was a chance meeting between Mark Rogers and Patrick Gallagher. Mark spotted Patrick in a Manchester library drawing some comic strips, and they got talking. They realized that they're both in this business, and they both had this idea that they wanted to do something new with kids' comics. They were fed up of the rules, the regulations, and they wanted something completely different, where artists and cartoonists, writers, they weren't going to be not even strip length was going to be an issue, because when you read through an issue of Oink, the comic strips are all different sizes, shapes and sizes all the way throughout, and regular characters can chop and change every issue. And they got together with Tony Husband. There were plenty of meetings in pubs putting it all together, and very drunken meetings apparently. But it took a few years to put together. First of all, it was going to be called Rasp, as in, blow a raspberry, with like 3 or 4 S's in the title. And it was Bob Painter, who worked at IPC magazines, who they say is the champion of Oink. He noticed that an awful lot of it was pig themed, and he suggested the title Oink. And then Patrick Gallagher designed that wonderful logo. But then it had a dummy issue. It was taken to IPC. They liked it, but they wanted some things changed. They created another one. I think it was like 3-4 years altogether in development. An awful lot that was in that dummy issue is in the preview issue of Oink, which is why you can see when you go from the preview issue to number 1, Oink's very random and thrown together. Obviously, it's very professionally put together, and it takes an awful lot of planning and forethought to make it seem that random. But definitely issue 1, you can tell, they've been told a good while ago, you've got the green light now, let's produce this professionally, but never lost that edge. But that's sort of how it came about. And another big thing they wanted to do as well was to give ownership back to the cartoonists, so they own their creations. All sort of gentleman agreements, as I say, at the time. And I think Rebellion are now sort of, trying to, sort of corral everything together themselves. You've seen reprints of all the funny comics coming out. Oink's going to take quite a while, but they're working on it, which is good. But yes, ownership and full credits for writers and artists and everything, which these are all the ideas, the basis they wanted to put into this, and that's how it sort of came about.
Very rare at the time. I think Marvel UK had some flirtations with that, but it certainly even getting credit alone wasn't really a thing then. Only 2000 AD had really done that.
Out of IPC, my comics, 2000 AD is probably the only one that Marvel was quite good at it, but IPC wouldn't have until Oink came along, and then only a handful did, and after that, more and more recognition. Yeah.
So that was another barrier it broke down. So I wanted us to talk about the attributes of Oink. When we were chatting earlier, I described Oink as kind of like a sentient creature. I'll try and sort of explain what I mean by that. So you had Uncle Pig, who we mentioned earlier, would have done his editorial in character, much like Thor the Mighty or Star-Lord. But he would have done his editorial. You've got Uncle Pig's letter column, grunts, competition pages. Occasionally, if I recall rightly, he had his own half-page strip, but he regularly made interventions within strips with other characters, sometimes breaking the fourth wall to talk to the artists. Mary Lighthouse often had her half-page strip, and he would always pop up to shower her with gunk or to give her grief for her censorship campaign. And then between panel appearances, and I think it evoked a sense of engagement between the reader and Uncle Pig's life and Oink's life over time. And that played a big part in getting us back for more issues or getting us to write in with our suggestions. Everything, a lot of the other strips, and we'll come into talking about them, they felt like extensions of this attitude of pigs, or they were complementary to them. And there were little hooks as well, little hyper-narrative points within stories.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, when you read an issue of another comic at the time, every strip is full page or half page. Everything's on the same page every week. Oink, you didn't know what was going to pop up where or when. And for example, there's Psycho Gran, who will remember being created for Oink and being in every issue, but she wasn't there until issue 15, and even then she wasn't in every issue because there was more content. Tony said that they basically created enough to make two issues every fortnight. it felt sort of organic every single week, because it was chopping and changing. The strips could be a Pete and his pimple strip could be a page and a half one week, next week half a page. He could be in the middle, pride of place. Next week he could be hidden somewhere else. And Uncle Pig, yep, he was there throughout, and he got his own. A lot for maybe the first half of the Oink run, yes, he would usually be tied in with something relating to the front cover or the theme, and so maybe the inside front or back cover. Taking things out of Mary Lighthouse, should I say, stopping her from censoring the comic. But he also had some other strips where, for special editions, such as a Christmas edition, or there was a time travel issue. Every issue had a theme linked to it. When it was fortnightly, and one was time travel. And there was a multi-page, I think about 4 or 5 page strip of Uncle Pig spread throughout the comic, where he was on the run from some butchers. And so he grabbed some awful clothes and threw them on himself as a disguise, which coincidentally enough made him look like Colin Baker's doctor. And then he ran into a police phone box to hide from people. And of course he goes on an adventure then throughout space and time throughout the issue. But even then, this got into the other strips. One that we spoke about before was Star Truck, a photo strip.
Yeah, issue 3.
Issue 3, and then the first Oink book, the first annual as well, where they'd have a photo strip, but then there'd been several parts throughout the issue, but in between the different parts, they would pop up inside other stories and bits and pieces. And, as you say, it all felt like one big whole. It wasn't like a comic made out of different strips. It was just one comic. Yes, everybody had their favorite characters. Hand up, mine was always Tom Thug. But, he was very much part of Oink. Whereas, I feel if you read something at the time, Buster, Beano, yes, you're buying that comic, but it's very much individual strips make up that comic, whereas it felt like with Oink, they all made that bigger whole.
There's almost that thing where if you're writing for Babylon 5 and you've got to write in the J. Michael Straczynski style, it's almost like you can almost apply that to Oink, I think. Although it was, like you say, it was chaotic. It was like stomachs and intestines and bowels. There was always something different in there. And it was, and also, I mean, you had the themed issues were there like pretty much from the start. I think I don't know if issue 3 was the first.
It would have been the first, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And you had a lot of those icons there from the start, but you still didn't know what you were getting. It was still an element of enough chaos to surprise you and keep you on your toes. And
oh, yes. Uh-huh. You literally did not know what to expect every issue. You couldn't flick through to page 9 to see your favorite comic strip. You had to read the whole comic to find your comic strip. Yeah. You would, and again, like if there was any collection now of an individual character from Oink, I don't think it would work. No matter how good that individual character was inside the comic, I don't think it would work as well as if you were actually reprint whole swells of these comics together.
Right. I agree with you on that. Because I was thinking any of them could carry a 20-page comic by themselves. I'll very quickly go through a list of the cream of the crop. So we've got Uncle Pig and Mary Lighthouse and the Plops, Cowpat County, Tom Thug, Burp the Smelly Alien, Ugly Face Watkins, Horace the Hippo, is it?
Hugo the Hungry
Hippo. Hippo. Harry the Head, Pete and his Pimple, Hadrian Vile, Rubbish Man, Pete's Pup, The Amazing Crab Lads, Street Hogs, and they are all big. They're all just monumental and bursting with energy and excitement, and they could be, there's ranges of t-shirts there, toy ranges. Oh, and of course the big one, Oink's ambassador after Uncle Pig is Frank Sidebottom, who we'll talk about later. And did you feel the same way about the iconography, that it was just
everything was sort of big and bold? Everything was big and bold. And one example there is like Pete's Pup. I mean, as a kid, I can remember Pete's Pup, and I was very surprised to find out that it disappeared about after issue 10. It wasn't actually in. I think it reappeared maybe in a special or an annual later on, because they're planned so much in advance. But these characters who only appeared in so many issues, we all think in our minds, oh yeah, I remember them. They were in every issue because the characters themselves, as you say, are so big, bold, and in your face. Every single one of them. What I mean is, yeah, you're right. Any of them could hold up a 20-page whatever comic on their own, but everything sort of bounced off each other in Oink. So it did, because things could change from page to page. You could have something to do with the plops on one page and being rude. You could have Uncle Pig, Mary Lighthouse. Then you go to Frank Sidebottom and it's celebrity news. You then go to Tom Thug and Hadrian Vile. You go to very surreal humor, Jeremy Banks's creations, and then something else, a celebrity spoof. You know, there were so many different kinds of humor that they just take one of them and put it into a reprint, I think was sort of, you know, don't get me wrong, that'd be fantastic. You know, Rebellion if you're listening. But having so many, like a roller coaster ride every issue, I think that's, you know, what made it, you know, so popular.
Yeah, the issues definitely feel like complete works. I mean, yeah, okay, yeah, Rebellion. If you want to do an extended edition of issue 1, issue 2, yeah, a long play would be nice. We talked about those, you know, the chicken that runs through the story, runs through the comic. You get little notes down the side of pages, like check out page 27 for reference to this, and it's, you don't need to go and check out page 27, but that little hook is out there and you can go and do that. And yeah, it felt like its own organism.
Yeah.
Yeah, that surprised me. You said about Pete and his pup.
Yes.
Yes, that's one of my favorites, because Pete and his pup is kind of like a who's the artist on that, by the way?
A man named Jim Needle.
Jim Needle. I guess we'll just do a detour because we're here and I'm in charge. But Pete has his pup who is like a monster dog, is like a kind of a sort of a kaiju of dogs, with this great big
10 feet
snout,
tall, and
which, and the snout is like an extra set of eyes, and there's just hair everywhere. There's somewhat, we could just do like a podcast on one issue of Oink.
Yeah, there's not much to cover in each one.
So what we thought we'd do would go into detail on a few of the artists, and Ian Jackson was one name that particularly reappeared, and I think probably characterized a lot of the core or skeletal elements of Oink.
He probably had more covers than anybody else. He was the main Uncle Pig artist when Uncle Pig had his own strip. Very jagged lines. You know, there was a lot of the strips in Oink had very jagged lines, that are perfectly ruled panels, but his lines were very, very jagged, sharp. It's very hard to describe without actually seeing it, but it's very, very different. And the preview issue given away with Buster, I think Wizard and Chips and Battle, I mean, he had the front cover, and it's him with an issue of that same preview issue, or slapping it in his hand while he looks down on somebody who's on one of those medieval torture tables being stretched, and he's screaming, okay, I'll read it. You know, and Mary Lighthouse is looking on, disgusted by those people hanging up in the background, waiting to be tortured into reading the comic. This was the first impression, you know, that people had of this. I mean, as well as it came, you know, your Buster, for example, came in a plastic bag with a pink pig in the cover, and it was like that sort of very Beano-esque newsprint. And then in behind it was a comic which was lovely, glossy, shiny paper, bigger pages, and this on the front cover. I would love to have been a reader of another comic at the time and discovered Oink like that. I came to it in about issue 14. Because just the shock of his artwork, you know, and he didn't just do, he did a couple of plasticine covers as well, including the famous Oink book, 1988, with a big, anybody knows who's ever had a passing reference to Oink will have seen that cover. Just the full front page is a plasticine pig face, and you flip it back to the back cover, it's a pig tail and it's bum, and the Oink logo is back to front and everything. And
and you told me a story about that going to the developers.
Yes, the original version of that back cover, the tail wasn't exactly in the same place, and we had a little bum hole. Whenever it was taken to, you had to go to your local, whether it was a chemist or photographers, to get it sort of printed off from his original sort of big photographs he'd taken as plasticine model. They queried it with him, thinking that there was something dodgy was going on. And then IPC, who had been very laid back and lenient with them, said, no, we've already got trouble with W.H. Smith at the minute. You're going to need to cover that. So the pigtail was moved to cover that up, and a new back cover was formed. Yes.
By and large, Jackson's style was that sort of the panel structure was all over the place. It was chaotic. It kind of looked like it had been thrown on a page very randomly. And I'm thinking, I mean, after Pig and Mary Lighthouse, Hadrian Vile would have been, I think, one of his landmark strips.
That, before the days of desktop publishing, Hadrian Vile must have taken an age to do. It's all the writing is done with a typewriter, and it's all spelled wrong, but nothing's in a straight line. The letters are up and down. Every line is a different place. And it would have had to be cut and pasted. I dread to think how long that would have taken him.
So this was written off of, it was called The Secret Diary of Hadrian Vile, aged, I think, 7 5/8 initially, but aged as Oink comic grew older.
Yeah, he aged in real time, yeah.
And it was, the character, there's elements of the 2000 AD character PJ maybe in this. It's sort of an enfant terrible trope. Hadrian Vile just likes doing bad things to his parents and to his neighbours and the people at school, and writes them all down in this diary with, as you said, it's typewritten superscript and subscript. Terrible spelling, and putting it together, the free-flowing type script together with the illustrations. It must have been a very old school Zine-like thing where the type is being cut out and then glued onto the page and Tipp-X'd along the borders so it doesn't stick out.
Yeah, it must have been. When I hear about even of how shading and colouring was done at the time, when you think about the overlays, everything had to be done. Adding this on top of that again is just, it's insane. I sort of think sometimes, after the first couple of issues, the writing is spelt wrong, but it's all in very straight lines still. After that, then they start really going mad with it, and it stays that way. He stays it for the majority of the run. So he does. Hadrian Vile, definitely one of my favourites. It was basically an exaggeration of of the cliche of what a boy that age is. He loves creepy crawlies, hates girls, loves winding girls up with creepy crawlies, tortures his parents, hates school, but everything's taken to the nth degree. So it is. But then later on, his mum becomes pregnant, and the pregnancy sort of lasts almost the right amount of time. And then there was one of the things for a later issue of Oink was an Happy Families issue, which of course none of the strips inside had a happy family, but it was Hadrian meeting his baby sister for the first time, and it was a shock when it's a 3-page story, full colour, which is rare for him, and it was all the usual chaos. And then he's going to meet the baby, doesn't want to meet the baby, he has no interest in a baby girl in the family. Turn the page, and it's like a full-page portrait of him and the family, and the caption just says, "She's loverly," all spelt wrong. And that's it. And he does, first of all, after that, yes, the constant crying at night and the smelly nappies and all he hates. But then he starts to realise, she's got smelly nappies. I could use these and I could teach her things. And he sort of becomes her mentor, so he does, for torturing the parents. Yes.
I'd noted down that it's typical that panels are sort of overlapping and there's ink smudges. I think in the first one I counted like 9 ink smudges Ian had put all over the page, and it just gives it a really old school kind of, almost like, it's punk. It's like you can do this yourself.
Yeah,
you can. Although Jackson had, I think, a style I've come up with is somewhere between Quentin Blake and Ralph Steadman. There's that kind of thing going on. There's, I think, the first appearance of Hadrian's mother, she's just drawn as glasses and hips, and that's it.
Yes. I mean, obviously he didn't draw it like this, but the way it looks to me, it's almost like those fountain pens we had as a kid, those refillable ink cartridge pens where you would write and you would hear the scratch, scratch, scratch on the page as you wrote with them. And if you try to draw a thing with them, it would just be jagged, straight lines. That's, I think, if I tried to draw with a fountain pen, it'd be a mess, but almost like that's what he's right. I know he didn't. That's the kind of scratchy kind of feeling I get from his artwork.
I was looking at another piece of his I wanted to mention, and you can tell me if it's all the way through or just the one or two. I saw Golden Trough Awards, which is a sort of lovely illustrated character of their own. It was quite different, I think, from Vile.
They were semi-regular, so they were, and they sort of came in. The first for a half dozen or so, they were in every issue, and then they sort of came sporadic. But they're always there. Different artists overtook them. Tony Husband did quite a lot of them, and other people then later on as well. But in those early issues, Ian Jackson did a brilliant one. I don't know if you have the issue there of a garden, killer garden gnomes. And they're the creepiest looking things. So they are absolutely fantastic.
Yeah, I think I've got that. The first one I read was this guy as a seesaw, and he's got his son ready to drop a refrigerator on it, so the seesaw would catapult the guy to the moon. Mm-hmm. And the borders of this strip are all done in like a cinematic reel kind of thing. So, you're meant to evoke that you're watching a movie. And the guy, instead of catapulting the moon, catapults to Antarctica, where he's met by pigeons and polar bears, and then eventually NASA.
Penguins. Something you mean there?
Pardon?
Penguins. You said pigeons. Penguins.
Strange Arctic pigeons. Penguins. NASA finds a guy, he suspects he's an alien. And it's the sort of thing, reading this, I felt like I could jump off this at any point and just turn this into a film. It was very inspiring in that way. Very sort of, again, with the large S. Shall we move on to another artist detail? One we both love, Mr. Lou Stringer.
Yes. I don't think there are many comics as a kid that Lou wasn't a part of. In my house, anyway. Uh-huh.
Lou was responsible for Tom Thug, who I think is possibly perhaps one of modern British comics' most iconic characters.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
Definitely, no doubt. Pete and his pimple, Pete had just an enormous pimple the size of his head or slightly bigger.
It was more like half the size of his body, and it was off the end of his nose. I don't know how you ever saw where he was going, but yes.
Did you mention Pig Swilla?
Yes, that was one of his as well. A giant robot pig, obviously a take on Godzilla, but Pig Swilla. He appeared half a dozen times, always in sort of a big epic 2 or 3 page story. When it went monthly, about 6-7 page story. He was always in an event. So he was, in fact, in the second book, him and Pete and his pimple were in the same strip. So they were, but he was always an event when he turned up. Mm-hmm.
Don't know if by the time I got to Transformers and Lou was doing the backup strips and at Robokeepers and Codename Combat Colin, I don't know if I was cognizant that this was the Tom Thug, Pete and his pimple guy, but gotten lazy seeing Lou's work so much. It is wonderfully dynamic. It's just filled with puns, really daft puns, and funny, and
he likes a rhyme as well. So he does. There's quite a few strips in comic which were done in rhyme. Music Mad Joe and Her Personal Stereo, and a lot of different one-off strips that he did as well. He did an awful lot of one-off strips, and he also did Specky Hector Comics Collector, which Buster readers remember, but that was another one started off in Oink as well. Just a few times. He was only there a few times. But Tom Thug then, even though he was in Buster for several more years than Oink existed, he's still sort of more, people know where he came from.
Yeah.
He was Oink, first of all.
I wonder, is there any links in the etymology between Tom Thug and gammon? He is
That's a
just
whole other podcast.
He's a skinhead. He's got steel toe cap boots. He's got a cat called Satan. And it was this lovely thing in how Lou bought into the anarchy of Oink. And in that, typically Tom Thug strips would be a row short of a page, and the last row would be like a 2-panel. Initially, Tom Thug's Culture Corner, and then Tom Thug's Cat Satan, mini strips of those.
And then at one stage, because he couldn't tie his shoelaces after 10 issues, he was threatened by Uncle Pig, you'd only have half a page, and he was threatened again later on. He did something, and Uncle Pig said, "That's it, you're being cut down to half a page." And he was, for several issues, he only got half a page. So he did. Then Pete and his Pimple got a little bit more, and there was Pig Swilla and one-offs and all from Lou. But obviously, Oink was my first comic, and that's how I got introduced to Lou. But then the Real Ghostbusters, the Slimer strip in it, half a page, started out, it was Lou for the first dozen or so issues. He said he had to give it up in the end because he had just had that much work on. But then obviously Robo Capers from quite early on, and Transformers and Combat Column and all that there, and he did other strips for Secret Wars, and he was everywhere. So he was, sometimes he picked up a Marvel UK comic that didn't have a Lou Stringer humor strip in it. He thought, something wrong here, so
Lou's another one of those artists. I think I can't really imagine Oink without Lou.
Definitely not. Tony Husband said that Lou was and still is one of Britain's top cartoonists without equal. So he is. He just said to me recently, actually, when I spoke to him. Definitely, yes, I would agree with you. And a lovely man to boot as well. Yes. I met him at the Enniskillen Comic Fest a few years ago. Had lunch with him. Absolutely a complete gentleman.
Just before we jump off Lou, it's worth going and checking out. Is it loustringer.blogspot.com?
Just Google Lou Stringer Comics. You'll find it. Yes, he chronicles all his work that he does at the minute. He's working. He also does the Daft Dimension Doctor Who strip as well, and he's collected together his Combat Column strips. He's got 4 issues of those out, and his Brickman as well, his spoof of Batman, where he got hit in the head with a brick and became Brickman. We could segue off here in a completely Lou Stringer territory for the rest of the podcast.
He's an incredible blogger as well. I think there's so much comics history up there. There's so much in the way of samples. You can bring up a page or two on your screen, and I think possibly still doing work for Aces Weekly as well with
Yes, funny to mention that. This is at the time of recording this, we should say, the 50th volume has 2 new Psychogram strips from David Leitch and a brand new Combat Column from Lou as well.
Congratulations. Aces Weekly, if you don't know, is a digital anthology comic started by David V. Vendetta Lloyd, which showcases some of the best comics creators, like from decades back to the present day, to people making their mark for the first time.
Just before we head off from Lou, just a couple of wee tidbits about Tom Thug. He was the first comics character to leave school. Later on, he actually left in Oink. He left school and had to go and sign under the dole as well. So he did. This is towards the end of Oink's run. Now we went into Bolster. Bolster comic didn't want. He had to be back in school again. So the strip was called Tom Thug's School Days, almost like it was going back in time, and he couldn't have Satan the cat in Bolster for quite obvious reasons, probably. And Tom Thug brought Lou's first ever mainstream comics cover as well. Oh. On Oink, there's an issue where it's a School's Out special, so which always confused me as a kid. I remember getting Oink, and the School's Out special came, the first issue went into August, and I was thinking, I've been off school for a month. It's a bit late. That's how I learned that England have different holidays than us. But that issue, there's a little sort of effect. You would think almost like it was the sun was starting to set behind the Oink logo at the top, but it wasn't. There was a leak in the Oink Manchester roof. So there was, which made some of the ink run on some of it. They were able to save it, and that's this lovely effect of Lou's of this sunset. Wasn't it just a leaky roof in the Oink office? So it was. So there you go.
We mentioned earlier Frank Sidebottom, who I think is probably the best well-known of those. Well, one of the best well-known of those involved in Oink. I don't know where this. Frank Sidebottom was kind of always there, as I remember, in not just Oink, although he wasn't about until I think about issue 17. But he was always there in popular culture, making music, appearing on kids' TV shows, being interviewed on daytime TV.
I remember him from number 73, the Saturday morning TV show, which had Sandy Togsvig and on it. I remember him being on that and appearing, and I loved his appearances in that. I in my mind, my memory, I can't remember whether I discovered him in Oink or TV first. I can't remember because he was about just all the time. I remember didn't he have his own TV show from his shed in the backyard in Timberley, I think, as well, on children's TV?
Possibly.
I'm not too sure where I discovered him first, but you're right. I do remember him being in Oink and on the TV at the same time. Mm-hmm.
I think if you don't know who Frank Sidebottom is, write the name down, take 10 minutes later in the day and have a little Google.
Giant paper mache head is usually all you need for that. Uh-huh.
And I think we know a bit more about who Frank Sidebottom, or who was behind Frank Sidebottom, now Chris Civvy. But in those days, it was Frank. And he never broke character. And he spoke with a sort of a high-pitched voice. He had great big eyes, great big lips, a very big personality, a very warm person.
Well, yeah, Chris was friends with the team. I think they were introduced through Mark Riley, obviously Mark's connections in Manchester show business world. But he was brought on, and he was seen as a great asset because he was on TV all the time, and he could publicize Oink. Now, I don't remember that happening myself as a kid, but again, I'm 43 now. I'm not going to remember such things. But on TV and the pages of Oink, he was very much always about celebrity lifestyle and his celebrity friends who he had never met in real life. But as far as he was concerned, he had. And all these celebrities, every from Paul McCartney to Elton John, would always visit Timberley and come to see Frank. And in Oink, it was always sort of obviously newspaper cutouts of people's heads stuck in the comic strips with Frank, all drawn by Chris. I didn't know this till later on in life. I just assumed a comic artist did them for him. He wrote and drew them in felt tip pen. He did them in felt tip pen. So if you make a mistake with felt tip pen, you're screwed. But apparently they were really, Patrick Gallagher told me they were really time consuming, and he spent so much time on his work in Oink. He's a complete perfectionist. And we look at them now and you think that they're drawn with what we would have coloured in with as a kid. They're superb. He was there from issue 16 right to the very, very end. But he was sort of someone who could be on TV and promote Oink and vice versa. And it's kind of strange to see in some issues of Oink, he gives out his telephone number, his actual telephone number for fans to phone him. And if anybody isn't familiar with him, there's the Being Frank documentary movie, which is out, which has a big section about Oink in it. But the Frank film, which stars Michael Fassbender, it's a fictionalized. It's not Frank Sidebottom. It's written by, I want to say, Ron Johnson, one of the members, one of his band.
John Ross.
And so it's a completely fictionalized thing, but Chris Civvy was aware of it before he passed away, and he was very happy with the book and the script. He didn't want to be about him. It's more about, because for having a huge star like Michael Fassbender, he never comes out from behind the paper mache mask. He lives that character, and that's what the whole movie is about, is what Chris Civvy was going through mentally playing this character. So it's a very good study into what he was going through. But yeah, it was actually his passing then which got me interested in Oink as an adult. I read it on the BBC News website and no. And I got out, I think the last 2 issues I had surviving from my collection as a kid, bought a few more, joined the Facebook group, talked to some people. And then after a couple of years, I saw a massive collection of near mint issues and decided to buy them. And here we are, I'm talking to you now, and it's 35th anniversary, so it's all thanks to Frank in the end.
I was out yesterday, the day before, on the park bench in the sun, greenery, and reading Frank Sidebottom's top 10 tips for owning a pet. It felt very much like a prototype Vic Reeves.
Yeah, that's actually a good way of sort of the Vic and Bob, the Reeves and Mortimer kind of humor you would have got from their programs. Any younger listeners who say, "Oh, it's before my time," if you ever watch Would I Lie to You and the stories that Bob Mortimer can come out with and how completely random and insane they are, but always true, you would kind of get an idea for the kind of sense of humor we're discussing here. Yeah.
Frank stuff, whenever I would see him on television, it didn't feel forced. It always felt very laid back and just like talking to another human being. Frank's top 10 pets, them guinea pigs, great big shark, little fluffy kitten, number 7, a hippo, 6, an ant, 5, yetis, 4, stick insects, and there's notes for each of these. So them yetis are dead good, because if you film it in your back garden, then you will get it shown on TV lots. And for stick insects, be very careful when you buy a stick insect, as you could be fooled into buying a stick. There's more details about how to make sure that you don't get fooled into buying other animals and incorrectly. Like goldfish are easy because they're gold and they're fish. At number 3, some goldfish, 2, budgies, and number 1, Loch Ness Monster. But they're really hard to transport because they're about as big as a bus with a very, very long tail. So something big to keep it in, like a bus or a very, very big box. They're very, very friendly to people, but will attack a ventriloquist puppet on sight. And there's a photograph of Frank with little Frank, who was a small hand puppet version of Frank with the paper mache mask. And somebody is stretching out well, it's supposed to be a Loch Ness Monster. It could be a giraffe head, and it is attacking little Frank.
Yeah. His humor was some weeks you would get a comic strip, some weeks you would get his Christmas buying guide or a cut out Christmas card. You would get a billiards game to cut out and play with your cardboard cutouts of Elton John. I don't know where that idea came from. Mini posters, and he was on a few covers as well. There was an issue of Oink. We had Frank in the front as a reporter, and the big headline was John Peel. John Peel leaves the BBC, information inside, and you had to go inside somewhere and find it. And his big scoop was yes, I can report that John Peel leaves the BBC every day to go home and then comes back the next morning to do more work. And but then there was the story of, was the right point to put it in, about the Smokebusters special of Oink. There was a competition to meet Frank Sidebottom and Snatcher Sam, who was Mark Riley's character in the photo strips, and 3 young readers won the chance, were taken by train to Manchester and met Frank and met Mark as Snatcher Sam, as well as the 3 co-creators, writers and editors of Oink, Patrick, Tony and Mark. And they spent the day apparently promoting the North of England School Board had, whether they approached Oink or Oink approached them about a special, I think, 16-page issue of Oink to distribute free amongst about 10,000 schools, to get kids, to not take up smoking. And the kids met them this day, and they promoted the comic with all these signs of, Uncle Pig says don't smoke and all this in the train station. The press were there to take photos of it. They saw the kids off onto the train. They went home, and then all the ones that worked in Oink all lit up and started smoking. And it was caught on camera. So yes. But the end story of that was the education board then got back in touch and wanted 1 million copies printed of this Smokebuster special. Oink being independent by this stage, I think it was printed under IPC, but then Fleetway, Bob Maxwell's lot, had taken over by this stage. By the time they wanted 1 million, and Fleetway said, we'll step in and we'll print the 1 million for you. They needed money to be had, and then they never did. But yes, just one of many behind the scenes Oink stories I've heard over the years, which, some Anarchy behind the scenes as well as on the page.
There were a lot of great artists in there, and there's a few we could talk about. I mean, Mark Riley, you mentioned, who was the DJ Mark Riley. Mark Riley was very involved in Oink, in writing and drawing, and that really surprised me going back over those issues.
Yeah, he obviously played Snatcher Sam in the lot of photo strips as well, so he was put through the ringer, not a lot of them, I think. But he drew Harry the Head, probably his most famous one. He was in all the way through Oink. And Dr. Mooney, he's completely loony. And When Dinosaurs Ruled the Earth, which is just basically three panel strip every issue of dinosaurs just living as if they're in a contemporary world, dealing with their personal stereos and rollerblading and everything else. It made no sense, but that was the point, So
yeah, Charlie Brooker is the other very well known name.
He popped up around issue 15 or so with one strip.
Okay.
He was only 15. He was still at school. He sent some work in and they liked it. Now, obviously, how long it takes a comic to get printed. They then hired him. So he appeared in one strip, a one-off, and then maybe a dozen or so issues later. I could find it for you because I've got all the spreadsheets here, but don't want to come across as too much of a geek. You can edit this out. I know you won't. But then he appeared then, and yes, sort of more on the second half then of the run. He was in basically nearly every issue. And then as it went on and on, there were strips drawn by other artists. It said written by Charlie Brooker. There was even a strip of Pete and His Pimple of Louis Stringers, which was written by Charlie Brooker. He wrote an awful lot of Oink's daft quizzes and text features and all as well. So he was very prolific for all the age he was. That was his first gig, his first job. And now look at him,
Looking at what he later did on television and looking at Oink, I think you can see they're very complementary sort of styles. I think Oink definitely influenced him going forward. And
definitely. Oink definitely developed a sense of humor of its readers, I would say, for better or for worse. So I would say it's probably had an effect on him. That he did a lot of strips called the Swinelight Zone, a spoof of the Twilight Zone. Some of them could be quite dark, but they're very imaginative. So you can see sort of the little spark of what would decades later could have become Black Mirror. When you read back in them now, you can see his little hints. And his main strip that he did was The Adventures of Death, the Grim Reaper. And his adventures of trying to get people's corpses and their souls, and he was very funny.
The text features in Oink were one of the big things for me. I know we were talking about Viz, but if there was a significant parallel to be drawn, I think the text features right away from issue 1, there would be classified ads. You could order from GBH products. And they were wonderfully, wonderfully inventive.
I can remember as a kid asking, I think my brother, what does GBH stand for? And he looked, why? Why do you want to know that? But yes, they were always a mail order company which charged extortionate prices for cheap rubbish with threats inside their coupons and all if you didn't pay up. Yes.
You could order a kit to keep your budgie happy, and it was a bucket of soil and a spade and some water, and it was cost like £3,000. It would be used to lure worms, so your budgie hates them. And then there was for a few £1,000 more, you could order something to keep your cat happy, and it was exactly the same kit, but it included a cage for the budgie, so the cat could eat the budgie, and various iterations, which culminated in being reported to the RSPCA. It's like that old rhyme of, she swallowed the spider to catch the fly. Really funny stuff.
Yeah, the GBH book club was in the first annual. The photograph of Mark Riley with all these fake books, which they've actually drawn up they've actually created dust covers for all these books, just for him to get a photograph with them. With GBH Book Club, and it says they invite you to share the delights of a selection of exclusive titles handpicked off the back of a lorry. Choose any 3 titles for only 20 pence each. Postage and packaging, £118 per book. And it says the books you choose from GBH, their exciting collection are yours on free approval for 10 days, and then in very small writing, subject to consultation with GBH's team of highly trained karate advisors. After that, you better pay up or else, kid. Know what we mean? And that's what they did every issue. Yes. Mm-hmm.
And of course, that's a homage to the book collectors thing. I was reading one of them, and just a full page of them, and then an advert for a stamp collector's kit. And I was looking for the joke in it. Then I realized this isn't a parody of the famous stamp collector's kit advert. This is the actual advert on a page with all these fake adverts.
Yes, that's right. It did do it sometimes where all their fake adverts surround the real ones. I don't know what those companies would have thought about that, but yes.
I suppose we better go back to the illustrators. Davy Francis is a local hero. Mm-hmm. Cowpat County would have been his first strip in Oink.
It was actually the first strip.
First full strip in inside page.
On page 3 of the preview issue would have been the first actual strip. Farmer Giles met David Bellamy. So Bellamy was how it was spelt as well. But David Bellamy had that speech impediment. So he's greetings, I'm David Bellamy is the first thing said in an Oink strip. Yes. Oh yeah, Davy also did Greedy Gorb. He'd eat anything, and he literally did. 2 things David strips were always full of: background jokes and puns. And the puns are as atrocious as you want them to be.
Oh, terrible. Terrible.
There's a strip here, if I can just, for listeners as an example. I have the artwork, the original artwork in front of me, just not that I would mention it, of course. But it's a Cowpat County. And Farmer Giles is talking to a woman called Mrs. Dunn. And her son has moved away to London 3 months before, has never written to me, blah, blah, blah. And he said, I'm going for a pig show down in London. I'll go and see it. His name is Neely. So off he goes. And along the way, there's lots of little background gags. He's in a train station. There's 2 signs. One says 2 trains. The other one says 2 trains. Things like this. And then here's a sign for the toilets, but just says gentleman. And he says, oh, young Neely was always a gentleman. That's where he'll be. And he goes and knocks on the first door of the cubicles and goes, hello, are you Neely Dunn? And he goes, yes, but there's no paper. Well, that's no excuse for not writing to your mother. And that's it. It's a 9-panel strip for 1 pun at the end. So it is. Just works brilliantly. You can tell he's enjoyed drawing that whole thing just for this 1 pun. I always loved his work. I mean, and again, he would contribute lots of little one-offs. He also did Tarzipan, which was a Mickey take of Tarzan as well, and Marzipan, and lots of little things. But Cowpat County and Greedy Gorb were his main ones. Yeah.
Cowpat County, I always thought of now is probably going to get me into trouble, but a documentary based in rural Ireland. And it is just laden with village idiots, intellectually lacking yokels. It's quite offensive, actually. It's loaded with stereotypes. And
the great thing is, though,
it's the fun of it. It's
he would always bring in posh characters or characters who would be the kind to take the mickey out of farmer types, as you know, that sort of stereotype, as you say, which could be seen as, oh, it's unfair to stereotype them. But whenever he brought in characters in who would sort of take the mickey out of them, the farmer won every single time. Without trying.
Right.
It was always the people who came in he would be the kind who would, to take the mickey out of out of someone who spoke with a farmer's accent. They would always end up themselves, covered in cowpat or something happening to them. And the farmer would do nothing to bring it on. These people always invited disaster themselves. Oink had a lot of messages like that in it as well. Like Tom Thug, always the bully never wins. Things like this. All its anarchy and everything. It was more subtle than other comics. Yeah. Yes, definitely. But the messages are always there, just not in your face. But Davy is a great man, and to this day, he's still quick with the pun.
Yeah. There's a lot of use of, I don't know if is it Letraset it's called, but there's like built backgrounds and built wallpapers, along with his sort of trademark, his trademark grass, his little sort of scratchy lines. He has a specific way of composing patterns on his pages. Like Lou, Davy's just one of those always great artists. You kind of know what you're going to get, but you're still taking on a wild ride.
Yeah, and he loves to talk about Oink. Although that's the same for pretty much anybody I've had the chance to speak to about the comic. They love any chance to talk about this particular comic. But Davy, without wanting to sound like a broken record, Davy is another complete gentleman. Lovely, lovely person.
I love Banks's Bert the Smelly Alien.
Yes.
So this alien that wants to fit in, essentially he has 2 giant eye stalks and just a head full of goo in a spaceman's uniform, and he He has his UFO, and he goes back and forward to Earth and other planets, but he seems to be trying to fit in on Earth. There's an early issue where the whole page is just green, flooded in green, except for the exposure of this hot air balloon that's sailing through the skies at an accelerated speed. So there's consideration of elements in there as well, science learning. And it's really neat. Banks does his lovely... his line work is quite adept at being bold, but also detail.
Yeah, he brought enough of the surreal humour. Burp at the start was always, yes, try to ingratiate himself with humans, but everything he thought would help him would hinder him. And later on, we would see his work becomes more, the lines become less thick and more detailed, and all his internal organs start getting starring roles in the comic. They all talk. They're all sentient beings inside him, and they all come out at different times. I think 2 of his internal organs fall in love and want to run off together at one stage as well. And then he also has his little pot which hangs off his side, little glass jar.
A pot of poo.
It's called his pet specimen from Uranus. Yes, so you can draw your own conclusion there. But
Burp discovers his nemesis, Dr. Devious. He unmasks him, and it's actually his liver, which pulls a gun on him. But Dr. Devious is defeated by Kidney, his kidney, who comes out and it's got all that sort of, and it's just gross. It's tying into that fungus and boogeyman kind of thing.
Mm-hmm. And then the very last Burp strip was in the last annual, and I said it before, but this was like the perfect timing for me at my age. It was like a 7 or 8 page strip. He went on this big, massive, epic quest, which he had to go home to his home planet. This is what all his kind have to do at this particular age. And they go on this massive quest, and he fights off all these bad guys and does all these epicness, basically. At the very end, the whole point is he gets a special prize. Only a few select get it, and it's these 2 little furry balls. And they both have faces on them, and he gets to keep them. And we know what this is a metaphor for, but that arrived. I think I was about 11 or 12 at the time when I read that. I remember reading it and finding it funny. And about 2 years later, rereading it and finding it 10 times as funny. So what had gone over my head previously wasn't
it
anymore.
ages so well, doesn't it?
Yeah, it really does. I mean, there's an awful lot of contemporary stuff in there about 80 celebrities and things. I mean, you mentioned Margaret Thatcher earlier. She really had the hand taken out of her in Oink a lot, and Ronald Reagan and things like that, and the royal family at the time. It's very contemporary. Because we grew up with it, that still remains very funny. But the great thing about doing the old Oink blog was finding out about how many people were buying it and letting their kids read it, and the kids loved it. And only occasionally having to ask, what does this mean? But for the most part, just the actual humour itself still works, still stands up. Kev Sutherland?
Yeah. So Kev's been doing stuff, the Beano, and doing the Scottish falsetto sock puppet theatre. So you were saying Kev was very active in the latter half of Oink, contributing to the last issue particularly.
Yeah, he came quite late on, and then in the monthlies as well, he became more and more prolific. I think he mentioned he's either a third or a quarter of the final issue was all him. So unless he had a lot of stuff for future issues and they all whacked it onto the final issue, his main contribution was a series of completely unrelated stories just called Meanwhile. And it allowed him to have a completely sort of a one-off strip every time, but you knew his art style, and it said Meanwhile, you knew it was going to be something which just had a weird and wacky ending to it. Mentioned before, but Meanwhile at the laboratory was 3 different rooms inside a big massive scientist lab. All 3 of them are working on time travel, and they all check their watch. They're going to jump 5 minutes into the future. They check their watch and it all says 8 o'clock. They don't know each of them are doing the same experiment. It's over 2 pages, and they're all ready to try their experiment. They all flip their switches, jump forward or backwards, whatever it is, and then they all run out of their doors at the same time and ask each other at the same time, what time is it? And then they all look at their watch and go, 8:05, and they all go, damn, and they all slam their doors again. They've all been successful, but because everybody else has the same time, they thought they've been unsuccessful. He loved a good pun as well. He had a strip about the attack of the killer breakfast cereals, or the attack of the killer breakfast. That was it, and there was a lot of iconography there of Kellogg's and Weetabix and everything, killing people. At the end, it just finished. I said, to be continued. Yes, it's a cereal, and that was it, as in breakfast cereal, and it never reappeared.
Dynamic.
He was
punchy, big and sort of iconographic.
Yeah, it was very bold. It was completely different for what Oink had at the time. I think that's why he suited it well, because he was just something completely new. In those monthlies, Ian Jackson, he was barely in those last 6 issues, but Kev was everywhere. And he was sort of, Kev and Charlie Brooker sort of became the new sort of generation of Oink for those last issues, but their style was just fantastic. We could talk here forever about all the different artists, and I feel bad about anyone we're not going to mention. There's JT Dog, for goodness sake, as well.
I mean, JT Dog was such an important part of Oink. Again, his stuff was iconographic. It was big. The lead strip, Great Hogs, biker gang of pigs tackling a mafia boss, butcher boss. Of all the stuff in Oink, it didn't really land for me. It made me smile, and it was nice to look at, but I kind of it is as iconic as everything else. It's full color. The colors are beautiful on it. Reads more like a typical sort of action crime thriller story, but there happen to be pigs in it. And I think it serves as a sort of a more traditional sort of underpinning. Maybe keeps the rest of the magazine grounded. Street Hogs was just one. He did a lot of pin-ups and
he did this. So the Oink Superstar posters, which were Mickey Hambo, the P team, which was Mr. P, the Snout, Hamey Hallam, Grinding Mad Muldoon, and Hammable Smith, Peter Swilton. He did an awful lot of those. Yeah. He also, Mark Rogers wrote Street Hog. I found them very funny because to me they were a spoof of 60s Batman, which in itself was kind of like a spoof of Batman. So I really enjoyed it, especially the attack. Instead of having attack dogs, the baddies had attack butchers' plastic bags. So I did some plastic bags with blue and white stripes, killer teeth. And then Lee Stringer wrote Ham Dare, Pig of the Future, which JT Dog drew, which is a Mickey take of Dan Dare. But the artwork in it in particular, if you got rid of the snouts and put normal noses on them, would have looked perfect in Eagle. But then what I found out only recently from Lee Stringer is that while everybody else in Oink might have drawn their strips twice the size and then they're shrunk down for publication, JT Dog drew all those highly detailed full color pages at the same size as the publication, which is just over A4. So, I mean, he's no longer with us. But I mean, that's the great thing about Oink, is if there's something that doesn't land for you, and don't get me wrong, especially the early issues, it might be the occasional thing that doesn't land for me when I read it, but you're a page turn away from something really landing for you. Every page could be so different that people with completely different senses of humor could collect the same comic.
I really love Daz's stuff. Kind of like a very simple, minimalist, like if you think of children's storybook illustrations, we have circles and very squares, very simple shapes. They're in primary colors, and they're stories about 8 panels long, told in rhyme form. And about the third act comes in and everything sort of starts to get really ugly, and there's snot monsters and there's giants with teeth, or there's curses.
Mm-hmm. Very much Daz's style with what look like typical children's storybooks or children's comics. Yep. But then as you dove deeper into it, it just went completely insane. Yes. There were almost 80 artists, 80 or 90 artists or writers that contributed to that comic.
Oh.
And that's why you get certain people like David Leitch, he's so, to me, connected with Oink, but he wasn't in every issue. He just didn't have the room. Tom Patterson was in a few of those early issues. And Graham Exton he was a writer for Whizzer and Chips and Buster, and then he wrote an awful lot for Oink, especially in the early days. He was good friends with the editors. He wrote an awful lot of very pun-laden things. He always said himself, one of his strips would have maybe enough puns to last him maybe 10 strips if he had actually just calmed down. He robbed himself of work. Tom Patterson was in maybe half a dozen issues around the start, but they said basically he would have been perfect for Oink, but he was just too busy being every single issue. They said they would have loved him, which is why his stuff at the very start is typical Tom Patterson, but without the restrictions in place. You have another comic, so he's given free rein. do what you want. And it's great to see he has a book coming out this year, reprinting an awful lot of his work across his many comics, with a brand new cover by him. And the Wet Blanket, which appeared in one issue of Oink, is on the cover. The Wet Blanket is a character who just meant to be a superhero, more like a super villain, just didn't like anybody having fun. So he wanted to go and be a complete wet blanket and drain the fun of everybody else's existence. But he only appeared there once. So the fact he's on a front cover of this new book from Rebellion is great.
Yeah, another great consistent artist was Haldane, who did Rubbish Man, which was quite a bright, colourful story about Jimmy Bone, I think, who goes into a bin and changes into Rubbish Man and generally saves the world regularly using any old crap he finds lying about.
He can also shit out moldy custard from his fingers. He stinks as well. He always have flies around him. He saves the world, but then nobody wants to be anywhere near him afterwards. Yep. Everything from cold custard to mushy peas to anything that's sort of gone off or smelly, stinky, lumpy, he can shit out from different orifices around his body. So he can defeat the bad guys. Yes.
And Haldane was one of those artists that seemed to be in a lot.
Yep. He's in every single issue. Haldane, in Hugo the Hungry Hippo, he was a giant skyscraper-sized hippo. Those little strips there. He also did Zoo Town, which was
a great one.
If we had sort of when dinosaurs ruled the earth, was dinosaurs in a contemporary setting. That's what Zoo Town was, just with different zoo animals. But yes, Haldane.
Some of those were quite dark.
They were. Yes, they could be quite dark. There was a little sort of furry or bear creatures always seemed to be coming off the worst for wear against the alligators and the crocodiles and everybody else. Yes. Haldane was another one who, when it came to the end of the monthly comics now, he was one of the ones that didn't appear every issue, along with Jeremy Banks actually as well. They disappeared. So they did, unfortunately. Once we get off this podcast, we'll think, we should have mentioned them and them too. The front cover of the first annual in the corner of it has something which, as a kid, didn't pay much attention to, but it says all new stuff by Britain's Best. I think as an adult, I read that and go, yep. These people were from all walks of life, not just cartoonists that were on contract. They didn't have to necessarily work for children, but it was a collection of the best talent. We were spoiled.
We were still in 2000 AD's golden age when Oink was out. We had Transformers, which was seriously competing with 2000 AD, which was just quite strange. And we had Oink perfectly holding its own.
Oh, yes. Oink was my first comic, 80s comics.
Rebellion, if you're listening, Oink.
Yes.
So you were talking earlier, and you said Oink started to get put under the grill, as it were, with
very, very apt for pigs, yes, under the grill, yeah.
The end of the second year, Robert Maxwell's corporation pushed it to go weekly, which was definitely not part of the plan.
No. IPC were very happy with it. I mean, you have things like Buster and Whizzer and Chips maybe selling 250,000 a week. Oink was 100,000 a fortnight. So you could say it was quite different. Oink was more expensive, a whole whopping 30p, and Buster was 24p. But it was bigger pages, glossy paper, which meant the colours you could have proper grey shading and everything in it, which Lee Stringer talked about that before, where you couldn't have any shades of colours in other comics, but you could with Oink. But also the fact that it was fortnightly meant newsagents would want it to be that little bit more expensive to make up money.
It was the celebrity's choice of comic, wasn't it?
It was. IPC got a lot of press from it, and plus it was independently produced. They were basically going, "Way you go, do that," and that's it. Sorry to go off on a tangent, but just one wee story remembered. Lee Stringer said, "You've been let to go off and do their own thing." Lee Stringer said there was once IPC stepped in and said, "Can't have that," and they made the situation worse. Tom Thug thought he was going to learn to be a sumo wrestler. They really beat the kids up at school, so he had this sort of big thing tied around him, like the adult nappy kind of a thing, tied around him, and he was doing his moves, leaning over, lifting one leg up in the air at a time, and a girl walked past. As he lifted up one leg, this big word, flarp, came out as if he was farting at her, and she was all shocked. IPC said, "We can't have that word. We can't have that word. That's too far." So he took the word out, But now it just looks like Tom's exposing himself instead, which to me is an awful lot worse, Yeah. But that was the only time they just said, no, you get on with it. So I think that was part of the whole thing as well. And Oink, merchandise-wise, they had a record, they had a computer game, T-shirts, sweatshirts, a club, they had bubblegum range released. And then Yorkshire TV came in wanting to make a TV series as well, which ended up being Round the Bend. So IPC, I think, saw the potential of it being a brand as well. But yes, then they sold off all their comics to Fleetway, Robert Maxwell, and they didn't want as many comics as what they bought. So they divided the comics up into sales groups. So all your big, massive sellers, Bolster, Wizard and Chips, etc., were all put in one group. And then the second highest sellers, Oink, I think Nipper and a few others were put into another group. Bolster and Wizard and Chips had a paper upgrade, but it meant Oink had a downgrade. They were upgraded to a better quality of sort of matte finish paper. It wasn't the newsprint, but it was like a matte finish. But Oink then lost its gloss. It was still fine for all the shading and everything as well, but Nipper and the rest of Oink's group were all cancelled off, but Oink survived because it was still doing just well enough. But yes, then Maxwell's lot said, well, if you're going to survive this, you need to go weekly so we can get double the amount of money in. And speaking to Tony Husband recently for the blog, he said that's when the fun went out of it. He said, we were producing a weekly comic on shit paper. Sorry, am I allowed to swear in this? The paper went really downhill then as well. It went down from 32 to 24 pages because they had to produce this independently. The subjects went, and for the first half dozen issues, that cardinal sin, Oink was organized. Every page had a certain strip on it every week just to be able to churn it out, and sales started going down. As a result, it lost its edge. Ironically enough, about 10 issues into the weekly, they found their mojo as if they had, were getting into the swing of this. And it became very, very good. But by this stage, what had basically happened was a lot of the younger readers, which should have included me at the time, left. But Oink always appealed to a wide range of people.
If they'd stuck fortnightly, that would have lasted 4 years before they got to issue 100, which is an ideal time for that sort of demographic.
Oh, God, yeah, definitely. I mean, I wanted to go on to see what Adrian Vile would get to. Is he going to hit puberty? Is he going to get those very little balls from Burp the Alien? The ones that kept with the weekly comic were all up in their teens. There is mention of it made by Uncle Pig. Interested the Grunts page seems to be our main audience now, are snot-nosed little teens, and he's standing there with lots of little zits on him, popping all over the place. But I was originally a target audience, and I still stuck with it all the way through. I'm sure people did, but when Fleetway saw the sales were going down, now teenagers were more interested. They then decided, right, we're going to change it again. It's now going to be a monthly comic magazine. You mentioned it before saying, oh, we won't mention Viz. Just to explain why you said that to people listening, there's this error everywhere. It says Oink was a children's version of Viz. Oink was inspired by Viz. It wasn't. It was inspired by what we've talked about before, about why they wanted to create it, but any inspiration would have come from Mad Magazine rather than Viz. Viz artists, a lot of them started out in Oink. A lot of them worked across both comics and they were friends. But it hasn't been mentioned that Fleetway wanted their own version of Viz, but that's kind of what Oink became in those last 6 issues, the monthlies. They want now to go, right, we're going to go for the teenage market now instead. And apparently the sales dropped right down to about 10,000 per issue from 100,000.
Seeing it on the top shelf. They couldn't reach it.
Yeah, that happened very early on. It was W.H. Smith was behind that originally. There was a comic strip in issue 7, which took the mickey out of family values, basically. And a lot of parental groups came down on it hard. And parental groups, or as I call them, Daily Mail readers, came down on it hard. And W.H. Smith then top shelved it. And the strip was one of those sort of picture panel stories, which you're getting sort of a kid's storybook, like you talked about Daz's before. And it was about Janice and John going to watch Daddy doing his parachute jump. See Daddy jump from the plane. See Daddy wave at the children. See Daddy continue to wave with both arms. Hear Daddy shout and scream. See Daddy as his parachute doesn't open and he lands on Janice and John. Watch Mummy hide the parachute bag, which she cut the cords to earlier on today. See Daddy, Janice and John in hospital, and then See mummy relaxing at home with a bottle of wine. Clever mummy. And it was something like that, right? And this caused uproar. So you're talking from about issue 8, 9, 10-ish. It was top shelf by W.H. Smith, but it still got that 100,000 every issue. It consistently. Oink started doing a thing. No, comics at the time had a little thing saying, "Cut out this coupon, take to your newsagent, and reserve your comic." Did you ever do that as a kid? I just asked.
Yeah, I just asked too. I wasn't cutting up a comic.
Neither was I. But they started saying things like, some people don't realize how clever Oink is and are putting it on the wrong shelves. If you don't see us, ask. They started saying this in the comic after a while. But it kept its... that is another myth about it, that something happened in Oink, it was top shelf, and that's what killed it. It didn't, because that happened very, very early on. But that is why you couldn't get it. But that's what happened in the end. It went monthly, new logo and everything. A lot of the artists and characters weren't in it anymore. Yeah. Don't get me wrong. Again, give it the first few monthly issues are very clearly a lot of stuff in the weeklies all jammed into one big issue. After a few issues, it finds how to do a monthly comic. You've got like a 8-9 page Pig Swiller. You've got big multiple page. You've got a Street Hog story which goes all the way through the issue. Things like this. They get into we understand how to do a monthly comic now. But Tony Husband said himself, it ended at the right time. He said the fun had gone out of it whenever the publisher started interfering, which was the whole point of Oink in the first place, to get away from that. Ironically enough, my golden age of Oink is whenever it does go from the glossy pages to the matte finish, not newsprint, but the matte finish, sort of issue 36, where to explain the change in paper, Uncle Pig gets hit across the head and goes doolally for an issue. So it's all the plops are going, what's going on? The page is all the wrong color and it doesn't feel right. And all this here, and strips are being drawn by the wrong artist and all this, and it all goes crazy. And when I was a kid, I thought the next issue is going to go back to normal again, and it didn't. But the quality, Charlie Brooker and David Leitch, all the ones you associate with Oink were all regular artists at this time. And it led up to that Oink book as well. So that sort of 36 to 45, 44, and the Oink book, that's just one perfect issue after another. There's not a single thing where you're going, that didn't land. Everything is just bloody hilarious.
What do you think the legacy is of Oink in terms of general culture?
A lot of people who read Oink group their work in comics or other media. You have people instantly in comics you think like Jimmy Smart, Andy Fanton and all, who work in things like that with the Dandy when it was about, and the Beano. The last couple of years of the Dandy, when it changed, it was as close to Oink as you could get while still being the Dandy. When Harry Hill was like the cover star, his madcap sense of humor is basically Oink given a human form, I think. But those last couple of years, there was even mad advertisements, and that's what they were called. Yeah. That was lifted straight from Oink. The strips were all different sizes and shapes, great quality paper. I think off the back of that then as well, I think it's just a more acceptance to have wild and wacky humor and not to be constrained by rules. You have people like Charlie Brooker who started out there. Look what he's creating. The screen wipes when they're on, Black Mirror, the kind of just surreal and dark humor. He grew up thinking all that, Yeah. And you look at the Beano now, and it's just the variety of the strips that are in it. Unfortunately, there's very few humor comics out there at the minute. I know Rebellion keep dipping their toes in, and with these core Buster specials, is there a market here? And
could I risk bringing up Viz again? And I am wondering because Viz's heyday came after Oink's heyday. And I'm wondering, were people looking for Oink in Viz? I certainly remember going out and seeing short-run Oink-like comics appearing in the years afterwards. And
Acme and Zip.
Yes. I think there was one called Gas or Fish.
Yeah, there was Gas, and there was one called TV Help, strange one. I remember buying an issue of it. Yeah, some of the Oink artists were in some of those.
Right, but it didn't feel like Oink. Never felt like Oink. And Viz didn't feel like Oink either. It had its own thing going on. And so there was this weird thing happening in the market where people were trying to recreate Oink.
Yeah, it seemed to be it happened after Oink was cancelled. They all started wanting to copy it, and to me that was strange. So I think, well, if a comic's been cancelled, why do you want to? Why weren't you copying it during its heyday? But it seemed to be, must have thought there was a gap in the market now, but they didn't get what they seemed to miss out on was they were sort of more going for the rudeness. So they were without the innocence.
Yes.
Oink was rude. It was anarchic, but it was never something that wasn't suitable for children. Whereas these other comics seem to want to be more like something like Viz, but at the same time be able to go on the shelf alongside children's comics and try to push that barrier. Oink just seemed very natural. These guys were just trying to make each other laugh, and we were in on the joke. We were part of the gang. These other comics were trying too hard to replicate a formula, and that's something Oink broke.
Yeah,
was a formula.
Because Oink, we were part of Oink. It included us in that story it was telling. I spent a lot of years reading underground comics in the UK, photocopied stuff. But I think about artists like Ralph Kidson, Sean Duffield, who do really good humour stuff. They're people who are genuinely funny, with a great comic timing. We talked about how Loose Stringer's still out there doing stuff.
Even though those other things like Acne and Gas and the rest of them didn't last very long, we seem to stretch that sort of thing, that sort of legacy, and it may have taken a while, but comics seem to be more open to then sort of just a bit more crazy, a bit more wacky. After Oink finished in 1988 with another couple of specials after that. And I remember the early 90s on TV. I know these are American cartoons, so obviously they wouldn't have known about Oink, but things like Animaniacs was just, random nonsense, but expertly scripted, and that's basically how I would describe Oink, but that seemed to be that kind of humor. And maybe here in the UK, Oink helped us develop that kind of humor. So those shows were popular over here, and it's just sort of, I think America here, around the world, I think the late 80s was just that time where lots of new ideas were happening, lots of changes of humor, and the way kids were entertained were changing. The reason IPC leapt on Oink was because they saw television and computer games as decimating the comics industry and needed something fresh and new to take them on. And I think the same basically with cartoons and everything. Whereas you had cartoons and comics, now you had so many different things competing for kids' attention. I think around the world, kids' entertainment was evolving and changing. The turn of the millennium there, SpongeBob arrives, and I'm a big fan of SpongeBob, I have to say. Just that sense of humor, I think Oink played a key part in that in this country, but it was happening everywhere. I remember Red Dwarf came on maybe just after it, but at the same time as Oink, Spitting Image was on, which I shouldn't have been allowed to watch, but I did watch it at night time on a Sunday night. My mum and dad hated it, but it was that same kind of thing, and just that sense of humor was there, and Oink was like the way that sense of humor was being brought to the children. Off the back of that, I think that has really sort of developed what we enjoy, but also then what was created, because people who've grown up with this have now gone to create as well. So I think every generation will absorb their entertainment and go on to create something for the next generation. And I don't think Oink can be, okay, people say, only lasted 2.5 years. I don't think it can be underestimated, the impact it's had.
Oink felt like it was taboo. It was getting out from the cracks, and you weren't supposed to have access to it. And that felt incredibly sort of empowering to have that. To
this day, I mean, I have a lot of very happy memories associated with the times I was reading the comic and around that time. I can remember discovering my first issue. I can remember my late nanny laughing at a cover that she saw. I can remember the heartache going down to late afternoon, running to the comic shop, and I'd always go and check the newsagent, always go and check the comic shelves first before going and getting my reserved comics. And it was Oink Day. And out of the corner of my eye, I thought I could see Oink logo somewhere else. And I spotted it, and it said Oink stars join Bolster. And I just thought, no. It was the Bolster issue. And I went up to the counter and asked for Oink, and it said above the logo, the loud one, the loopy one, the last one. And I bought it and I flipped through it, and there was Uncle Pig saying it was going to be the last issue. And he was taking all the fortune he had made from Oink to a deserted island to live the lap of luxury, and he was selling off 3 of his characters to Bolster. And I bought the issue of Bolster that same day, read it, enjoyed the 3 Oink strips, although they felt a bit different. But I couldn't, for being the age I was, I thought to myself, I can't justify 28p every single week to my parents when I'm only going to read 3 pages. But I can still remember that, and I didn't want to read that issue. I didn't read it for about a week. I didn't want the end. So it was heartbreaking. I remember at the time, that was my first experience of a comic being cancelled. An experience which happened far too many times over the next few years after that.
Yeah. As soon as you had your first merger or two, you realised what a nail in the coffin it was.
I was starting to think after a few years I was a scud. Every comic I decided to start putting a reservation for it ended.
It's all over. You've destroyed your childhood. As listeners will be aware of Phil, or if not, I've picked up, he's a massive expert in this stuff. About 7 years ago, you started running the Oink blog, reading issues of Oink on the anniversary of the day they were published and blogging about them. Recently, maybe a couple of years ago, you closed up shop and are rebuilding the Oink blog from scratch.
Yeah, just this year. 2013. So long ago now. That's 8. I was going to say 7 years, but no, I ran it for 7 years. That's actually 8 years ago now. As I said previously in the podcast, I had a few issues, and then on eBay, I noticed this almost complete set, mint condition. I bought them, and chatting away to Lou Stringer, he gave me the idea saying, why don't you read them on the date of their release every fortnight? And at the same, he didn't know this, but at the same time, I've been looking for something, this newfangled thing called blogging I wanted to take part in. So I thought this would be something else I would lose interest in for a few months. I thought, I'll give it a go. And so I started it, and I carried on. Many nights, coming into work on a whatever day it was, maybe a Thursday, bleary-eyed because the night before had been the deadline to get the next Oink issue reviewed, and people in work are going, nobody cares. Why don't you just leave it for a day? No, it has to be done on the day. So I covered all the issues, and the Oink, it was going to be closed down, but then a trip to the Enniskillen Comic Fest, and I started then covering other issues, short-lived issues, short-lived comics as a child in real time. And by the time I got to the end of last year, I was doing it on the Blogger website, which is great for just sequential blogs, but I was trying to make it into a full-blown website, and it kept crashing on me. But realized this year is the 35th anniversary of Oink, and I wanted to do something for it. So I thought, right, stuff this. So I bought a domain name, no longer blogger.co.uk, just a oink.blog. That's it. Bought some web space, and I'm going to start it all over again from scratch. I have other comics I'm going to do as well. I've started with Marvel's Visionaries, actually the first one. But the great thing is, from doing Oink the first time, I started off just being a fan, reading it and learning about the making of it as I went along. And when I read back over those first posts, I cringe. You're a writer yourself. It must be the same whenever you go back so many years and read some earlier stuff. You go, oh, I wouldn't do that way.
I'll never admit to that, Phil. My stuff's always like 5-star. Just first draft, right. When it comes out.
Oh, right, fair enough.
I know the symptom you're talking about. Yeah.
All right, okay. Well, you empathise then, right? So now, as those 7 years went on, I like to think my writing style developed, but I learned more about Oink. So now I'm sort of thinking, well, now I'm going to do the director's cut of this, and go back and properly review each issue in real time. Other comics. So it's now called Oink Blog, real-time reading of classic comics. It's a full-blown website now with different menus and stuff, which doesn't sound fancy to most people, but to me it's great. So this is what I'm going to do now, but Oink's going to start all over again from scratch. There's been a few bits and pieces up behind the scenes, things that were happening before Oink was released. April 26th, a couple of days from now, will be the preview issue, and then I think the same day this podcast is going to go up will be issue 1. So yeah, I'm actually looking forward to doing it all over again. I haven't read Oink since I did it that last time, but that's what I wanted to do, and yeah, I stuck with it. What surprised me was the amount of people that love it.
Yeah.
Came out of the woodwork saying, "Oh, I love this comic," are showing it to their kids. People are rereading it again. Some people don't have the comics, and so just the few wee samples on the reviews is what all they have access to. And they were loving it, and the humor stands up so well. I thought this comic deserves more attention. This was a huge part of so many people's childhoods and seemed to be sort of forgotten. And then to have people like Lou Stringer and David Leitch and Jeremy Banks, if anybody needs to know anything about Oink, they're pointing towards me. It's like, what? No, you worked on it. You talk about it. You know?
They're all so proud to have been part of that.
Yeah, they are. I mean, and they would talk about it. The cows come to the pigs come home, I suppose. You know, and last year, Comic Scene magazine asked me to write an article about Oink, and I got that published in their history of comics. And I wanted to get a quote from as many Oink guys as possible. It wasn't included in the magazine, but I've carried on trying to get some more quotes. And Tony Husband, instead of writing me a quote, said to me, here's my number, give me a call. We chatted away for about 20, 30 minutes. And he could just wax lyrical about it and the stories he tells about the making of the comic, the insanity of how it was put together. And you just get the feeling these guys could talk about it forever. But the main thing is, I just wanted to blog about it, but it grew into something. My love of Oink just came back and it became something so much more. Now I just want to write. And I'm going to be taking a creative writing course. I'm buying books from J. Michael Straczynski about writing, going, Oink, what have you done to me? And so it's basically, it changed my life as a kid. It's doing it all over again now. So oink.blog for it, and one at a time, other different comics from my childhood, which we'll discover as time goes on which ones they are.
You have your spreadsheets and databases that makes you light a day somewhere. You've been doing the YouTube videos.
It started off
comics.
Yeah, it started off as something which sort of, extra content, but now it's going to sort of be a monthly roundup of what on the blog. So looking forward to May. Will actually be 2 or 3 issues of Oink.
Yeah, they're quite watchable and quite casual in style.
Thanks very much.
I suppose there's usually something quite interesting in those.
Yeah, and actually, I left Facebook a few years ago, and actually Oink's been enough to suck me back in again. I realised there's an Oink group on Facebook with a lot of creatives on it and about 1,300 pig pals. I thought, well, I can't ignore that. So I'm even back on them on Facebook now as well. But it's proved popular, and I'm really enjoying it. And it's just a matter of reading these comics in a contemporary way. So if it's Transformers or Visionaries, I'm not thinking, oh, what was it like reading this back in the 80s? Like, how does it read now? And I think Oink has spoiled me for that. As you said yourself, you read it now, it holds up so well. You're not thinking, I'm reading an 80s comic. I'm reading a comic now, and I review them as I read them now. If something doesn't hold up well today, I'll say so. That's the whole point, just contemporarily reading these classic comics. So that's pretty much it. So 2.5 years ahead of Oink. Yep.
It's gonna be a good time. You're on Instagram as well?
Yep. Again, just Oink blog and Twitter.
Twitter.
They're mainly used for, Twitter and Instagram mainly used for publicizing what's on the blog. Instagram has another thing as well, which is Transformers. Marvel UK's Transformers. Started in the old blog. Every Thursday, I read the next issue. I have them all here. I've realized over the last 4 years, I do have willpower because I don't skip on. Every Thursday is what 32 years ago would have been a Saturday. I'm reading them one a week, and they read so much better with the cliffhangers and the anticipation. And I'm surprised I've managed so far. But I'm up to issue 215 or something like that. So a few photos. The reason I started doing that in the old blog is I wanted to cover the comic, but I thought it's weekly for 300 odd issues. That's an awful lot of work. And you could find out everything you want about these stories online. I need to do something new. And I thought, well, not many people, especially people in other countries, will have seen the physical form of these comics. And other people might like to reminisce about these physical comics. That's what I thought I would do. Just a little photographic journey through with a couple of paragraphs about each issue. I was writing them up on the old blog. I will start that again later on this year on the new one as well. So I've still got another 3 years of them to go as well.
Check out oink.blog. Thank you. Phil really helped produce this and sort of keep me steered on course. So very happy to have an honour to have you on here. Thank you, Phil. It's Oink.
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed it, Andy, and it's been a pleasure. Mm-hmm.
Cheers. If you'd like to know more about Oink, by all means check out Loose Stringer's blog, loosestringercomics.blogspot.com, as well as Phil's oink.blog. The Drew and Luke podcast is a free sample of Andy Luke on Patreon. For as long as I can afford to do this, I'll be talking about special comics, TV, film, esoterica. You can help by subscribing to patreon.com/Andy Luke or spreading the word. Let's get this audience into six figures. I'm in the process of switching podcast hosts to Anchor, where I can get accurate stats and more listening than I thought. If you enjoyed these 10 podcasts, write in and let me know. I'm tweeting as Andrew Luke. Drive a 10-ton truck through the subscribe button and blow it up with a rocket launcher while you fly free with your jetpack. Wave to the people on the ground. It's over there. It's over there. Thank you to Art Knipe, Ursula Hyder Ali, Michael Daly and all my subscribers who helped make my dream job a reality that way. And a shout out to friends like Sam Davis, John Robbins, subscriber, and the wonderful Susanna Raymond who keep me stacked with love. A new series of surreally funny comic strips is coming to Patreon in May, as well as a challenging epic poem. Ooh, and probably something else. You know I'm good for it. And it costs very little. Next time I'll have the gentleman Ian Lauder as my guest as we pour through the guts and trauma world of The Shield, seasons 4 to 7. You can listen to part 1 of our Shield series on Anchor FM, Spreaker, iTunes, Spotify and many affiliated and indie hosts. Thank you for listening.